what's the true purpose of cyber threat intelligence?
Stan, it looks like for this week, you've got a pretty interesting story with a little bit of a twist on cyber threat intelligence.
Oh, yeah. Actually, Matt pointed this at me, and I thought it was quite an interesting read. I encourage everyone to check out this blog and kind of read it. It's very eloquent in the way it's phrased and makes a couple of interesting points. I recently took on more responsibilities with cyber threat intelligence, so it was really interesting for me to read like someone's opinion who's been doing it for a while. So the author of the blog is Joe Slovic, and he has a very unique perspective into this topic. And one of the key points he makes right away is that cyber threat intelligence it's like a secondary function to support the security operations, and it's really there not to know everything about everything that could be possibly known about, but really to help improve operational workflow. It's to help protect, enterprises. It's to help protect and implement better response procedures by knowing more or by researching something more in depth. And as part of that, he made a couple of interesting statements that, as I was reading it, it kind of made me think through some of the experiences I've had with the topic of cyber threat intelligence. So one of the things he points out is that when cyber threat intelligence might be done, sometimes what happens is creates these enclaves or these like information sharing groups that share information almost like in this echo chamber with each other. Like, hey, we figured out this thing or we figured out that thing, and they kind of question like, how come nobody else knows about this? Right? And I've certainly been, this can happen anywhere in any working group. It doesn't have to be just cyber threat intelligence. I think any working group where you have a set of professionals that are kind of like insular and they're working on that problem, they always wonder, how come nobody knows about this? And I think the problem is they might not know about it because you might not be explaining it or might not be giving this information to them. For example, he talks about like, there's these very intricate like information disclosure rules, like who can tell something to whom, and everything is hiding behind the infamous TLP red, which means, it gets often confused with high quality information when all it really means is can't really tell anyone about this. And kind of the way he writes about it, I feel like it's very eloquent. I definitely encourage everyone to kind of read it and make up their own mind what they think about it. But it's certainly things that I've seen or I've experienced. And I guess the call there is, right, what's the call to action as part of what Joe says? And I agree with him here is make the information, make the cyber threat intelligence useful and operational. If you receive something that's TLP red, don't just hold on to it. Think of ways that you can share this information, maybe through parallel construction or getting at it, and so it can really help the people on the front lines, the SOC, the incident response team, take advantage of the information you have to offer. Of course, there's also something to be said about like strategic intelligence to help you identify where the gaps are, but that's almost like a secondary thing. One comparison he makes that I think is really entertaining is, when you're thinking about your house burning down, you kind of have to deal with that first. And you can't plan on building like an addition to your house, which is like strategic cyber intelligence. Yes, you should be planning ahead, but make sure that you've got the fire put out. Anyway, it's very interesting. I encourage everyone to read it. It certainly gave me, a lot of interesting things to contemplate. A lot of interesting points there.
Yep. So Stan, not to take this too far down a wild tangent, but I think one of the things perhaps, I know that we had spent a reasonable time kind of wondering some of the same things about, like we see all these botnets. Some of them are quite huge and doing a lot of activity. And it was actually unclear why we weren't seeing or hearing more of it. And I think part of it is different organizations have very different perspectives of things. And one of our advantages was, as a large network service provider, we could see a very broad view of things, not very much detail about each one of those things, but we could see a very broad view of what was happening on the network, able to pick up on scanning events and able to characterize those in ways that you couldn't do without a large volume of the activity taking place. And it reminds me of how, hindsight can be very 20/20. And I think you could go through the patent repertoire and just find all kinds of things that you read the patent. It's like, oh, gee, no, it's obvious. But it's only obvious because you've already read the patent. A couple of things that come to mind is string trimmers. The whole idea of a string trimmer, the original guy that created that, it wasn't that long ago. It was maybe 25 years ago. It was created with a coffee can and a string. And in fact, wow, this was a whole new invention to be able to actually do trimming with something that wouldn't cut your leg off if you, you missed or something. But it's become a staple in what we do. Another one that comes to mind is there's actually a patent. It's actually infamous, of entertaining a cat with a flashlight, shining it on the wall and moving it around. And it's like, everybody knows that, right? Well, no, not unless you actually make it a known thing. And so I think that's the kind of thing here that we need to recognize in threat intelligence. That is, just because it's obvious to you and your role and the activities that you do, doesn't mean that it's obvious to others. And even the value that you get out of doing the analysis and building a perception about what's going on, what the motivations might be, that's your opportunity to make it more operational, as you said. And that's the real story. The tendency, and as well, Manny, as well, that my pet peeve about threat intelligence sharing has been, it's been a bunch of IP addresses with a big so what behind it. 10,000 addresses with 10,000 question marks about, well, why do I care about this address? And it's more about the story, to be able to recognize, if you see this kind of activity and you see it might be motivated to do this sort of thing, and these are the kinds of actions you want to take to try to prevent that from happening in your organization.
Yeah, no, those are great, absolutely great points. I would like to just take a second here and just read off my favorite line of this entire story. So my favorite line of this entire story, which I think sums up the story very well. It says, CTI as a discipline needs to crawl out of it with respect to information and realize that our value is directly related to the ability of a supported organization to enable or improve defense. But that to me was, when I read that, I was like, okay, now I know what this guy's talking about. I understand what his point he's trying to make, and it is about that. It is about sort of being able to extract the information that you get out of all of these sharing groups and these lists and these everywhere else that we get information from. And if you can't get it down to the SOC and IR, the front lines, in some fashion that can help them take that information and actually use it in some form, I don't know what you're doing, right? It's the so what, right? It's like, I don't understand what are you doing? You can't just sit there and create reports or stack reports up in some spot where, as I think Stan, you were saying, the whole TLP read, you slam them away, no one can read them except for a very minute set of people, and what do you do with that information? So I appreciate, Stan, you taking this story. I think it was a great read, and a lot of the things really resonated with me when I was reading through it.
I think one of the biggest contributors, and this is perhaps sounds self-serving, but it's actually intended as a completely unbiased perspective. I think the Alien Vault, OTX, the what is online threat exchange, is actually one of the most valuable threat sharing tools that I have come across, because it's not just throwing addresses and things out there. It has the details in it, but it's really about creating an informational article that the folks can contribute to in creating a social media activity around threat exchange, or threat intelligence exchange. And I have not seen anything other. Now, obviously, bad guys can subscribe to that just as well as good guys, and just the same, bad guys can subscribe to this program just as well as the good guys. But the advantage here is that more informed good guys are better able to protect themselves regardless of what the threat activity might be.
You know, from what I've seen, the bad guys are already sharing information with each other. There's many forums where they share, you know, tips and tricks and exploits and 0 days. So as good guys, we should be, you know, doing the same thing and, you know, getting the next generation ready for the fight that's to come.
Yep.
Okay.
You know, the challenge has always been, and here I am, you know, being the executive here, but the challenge has always been is how much effort, how much labor it takes extra effort to take something and develop into a product that can be shared to others that can be used. And so the trouble is, how do you determine how much is the right amount of additional effort that you put into it? And you know, really kind of reliant on the teams to make that judgment. That is, have I produced something that's useful, and am I able to, you know, use that to help protect our organization? And it's turned out that I think to a large extent we've been much better at protecting ourselves based on using the threat intelligence. It's much harder to take information that you know and be able to provide it to somebody else that you not, you know, don't really have clear insight into what their context, their environment is, and make it useful for others. And that's where the challenge really comes in.